This is a Dutch testing report tutorial. Please do know that these are for educational information only to help you understand results and not intended to be medical advice. The results that we actually show on the screen are not from a particular patient, just meant to help in the conversation. So there's a lot of information, a lot of data that we can look at as it relates to cortisol. The primary information we want to look at is the free cortisol pattern. That's a really important bit of information. So we are looking at that in each of the 4 samples. So there's a waking measurement, and keep in mind waking urine is not waking cortisol. That's not the cortisol measurement right when you wake up. It's a sample from right when you wake up, which means it reflects the nighttime cortisol. Okay. Then in the morning we get hopefully a surge of cortisol. Cortisol is supposed to increase quite significantly upon waking, and we see that in that 2-hour sample, and then it's going to have dropped down typically quite a bit by the afternoon sample, and then at its lowest point at bedtime. So we're looking at the 4 samples. You want to look at your 4 samples and see, is there dysfunction in this pattern of this expected up and down pattern of cortisol? Then we're going to add all 4 of those up to give this number. So that's a calculated value based on those 4. And in this particular case, it's normal, right? So it's right in the middle of the expected range, so that looks good. That's free cortisol, and it's tempting to think that that well represents cortisol production. Cortisol production, however, is better measured by metabolized cortisol because free cortisol is only about 1% of the total. The metabolites are a better marker for total cortisol production because they represent about 75% of the total, and in this case, those numbers are low. So those imply that the total production, even though free cortisol is normal overall, the total production appears to be relatively low. So just backing up a little bit, the cortisol story, when cortisol is made, it's made predominantly from the adrenal gland in response to the adrenal gland seeing ACTH, which is a signaling hormone given by the brain. Then it's going to interconvert with its inactive form, cortisone, and it's going to circulate throughout the body as either one of those. And it's interconverted between the two by an enzyme called 11-beta-HSD, and that's sort of depicted by this 2-headed arrow down here. Okay, so cortisol and cortisone are circulating as free hormones. So since cortisol circulates as in both forms, you want to also take a glance at the cortisone pattern to see it confirming that story of cortisol. So primary importance is the cortisol pattern. Secondary and confirmatory job is for the cortisone pattern. And then both of those are then metabolized to cortisol and cortisone metabolites, which we call metabolized cortisol, which is again your marker for total cortisol production. And the difference between the two, if you will, in a relative sense, infers something about metabolism. So in a case like this, where the total production is actually relatively low and the free hormone is normal, implies that there may be decreased cortisol clearance. Now, cortisol clearance or cortisol metabolism can be affected by things. For example, it's upregulated in obesity. It's upregulated if there's elevated thyroid. It's decreased, and that's kind of the picture we see here, is lower cortisol clearance in low thyroid situations, low liver function. So that's something to maybe think about in a case like this. The other thing that we can think about and assess is whether there's a preference for cortisol staying in its active form or whether it's readily deactivated to cortisone. Now, it's tempting to look at this free cortisol and free cortisone pattern to try to assess that. But remember, the free hormone only represents a couple % of the total. It's the metabolites that really tell this story better, where we look and see, okay, does this patient have more cortisol metabolites or more cortisone metabolites? In a case like this, if that happens to point more towards cortisol, you might be thinking even more then about thyroid, because that is also something that is correlated to low thyroid. Is not only is the cortisol unable to metabolize downstream for excretion as much, the deactivation to cortisone is also blocked or made slow in a low thyroid case overall. So that's something to add into the picture as well. If they have more of a cortisone preference, then that implies that overall that there's more of a preference for that cortisol being deactivated to cortisone. So we want to look at the overall picture. Free cortisol over time, the total of production, and then any metabolic preference that there may be to well characterize the patient's cortisol. So I hope that's been helpful. Please do see DutchTest.com for more educational videos to fully understand the Dutch test results. And if you're looking at this from a patient perspective and you have questions about your own results, please do see your healthcare provider for those. And we thank you for testing with us.